do think we're ripe for this new technology cycle right now, where we're going from LTE to LTE Advanced, which is going to continue to cause equipment purchases, and we're going from, we are going to voice over LTE, which I think will cause a certain amount of equipment changes. Maybe there will be a pause a little bit between LTE Advanced and 5G, since we're still struggling to define 5G, but that's not for another few years. And I think what will happen is, yes, we've tackled the stadiums, we've tackled airports, we've tackled a lot of big venues, but a lot of those are in refresh cycles right now, and they'll remain in refresh cycles for a few years. And so then carriers will have to decide, okay, well, so we've tackled the big public venues. Do we, as carriers, go into more of the traditional enterprise space? And you are seeing that happening here in Chicago. You're seeing it happen in New York, where carriers are stepping up and saying, you know what? Yeah, that 70 floor high rise, it needs to be taken care of. Mm-hmm. And whether that is a carrier stepping up in some cases, or if it's a 3PO working in conjunction with the carrier, that's happening more and more. So I don't think we're done.
And Kevin, I'm going to get you some tickets to a game. You can go to or it might be a different college game.
Okay. I'm pretty loyal, so you have to watch out.
So we'll make sure they're competing. So yeah, anywhere in that food chain, right? So you have the enterprise, you have a 3PO, a host provider that might buy it, run it, operate it. You have operators. So I mean, naturally, somewhere in that food chain, there's some capital purchases that occur to put this equipment in place, and I think we've seen variations of models of who recoups some cost and who's paying for cost, whether that is a partial or full CapEx purchase, or whether it's distributed, and whether it's split out in more of an OpEx for one of those parties. But at the end of the day, I think you get it comes back again to how important is having coverage in a venue. Right? And when we talked earlier about the ones that are highest priorities as verticals, when it's on the mind of the venue because it's important to have a fan experience, as that example, then they start to plan for how this is going to be covered in terms of the cost. And that usually is in coordination with some type of third-party organization that operates it, or with one of the operators as a lead operator to put the system in place. I think the same is true for enterprises, right? If you consider an enterprise that operates a business and the business people in that venue utilize these devices day in and day out, and they realize the efficiencies of having regular connectivity for those individuals, it suddenly shows up on the agenda. Right? You were mentioning earlier you want this thing to have all bars, and when you use it, you want it to actually work, even though those bars are there. Doesn't always mean that data is moving where you think it is. So, I think when it's on the agenda of the interested parties, there's a place in that food chain to justify how that expenditure happens, and those models vary widely depending on the industry.
The one thing that gets me most excited about each of your business models is each of the CEOs from the big 4 wireless carriers. If I ask them what's the kind of keep you up at night moment, and it's the worry about churn going up. And we all know the reason for churn going up is not price, it's network quality and coverage. So good for your business. I don't want to monopolize. We have about 10 minutes left, so if there's any questions from the audience, we can take them. I think there's a microphone going around. There is.
Yep.
Any questions? Yeah.
We'll bring Paula back up.
I certainly have, Jay. Okay. I'll end it maybe just on the way we started the title. I guess, what are the points where each of your, kind of a loaded question again, but each of your respective companies can optimize this return on investment for, be it a carrier, enterprise, whoever your client is in a particular project?
Well, speaking from the enterprise side of thing, I think that what gets overlooked always is the front end and the planning of the front end. I don't know where the planning gets done, in some back room someplace, but nobody tells anybody about it. And there's a consultant that comes out of the back room with an RFP, and off you go. And no one has consulted the carriers, no one has, really done the kinds of heat maps and the kinds of things that you need to do to understand what you really need to do. So my advice to anybody, especially in the enterprise, obviously, is that the planning cycle really needs to be probably the longest cycle to really ferret out all the stuff that needs to be accomplished before you start the project, and have a clear-cut understanding of how you're going to move forward and why you're doing that. That seems to always be the biggest hurdle.
Boris?
As an equipment manufacturer and designer, we've gone to places where we think that we can make a difference to chipping away on the ROI model in two places. One was on the CapEx by successfully removing the interface between the base station and the DAS head end by working with an OEM, with Alcatel-Lucent, to do an all-digital CPRI interface between those, removing the need for the analog radio heads and POI points. And that in turn also pushes the OpEx down by reducing energy consumption due to the sheer units itself and environmental savings. So we are going in our domain, working with the ecosystem partners to slowly removing step by step places where we could influence the business model and enabling more business for the industry.
Kevin?
So I think it's pretty obvious. We've talked about the large venues, and when you're in a large venue, the money does flow, and so it's very easy, to generate that ROI. I think, it's the next wave of the market that we really, do need to focus on, and it's great, to be able to bring the equipment costs down and those sorts of things. I asked this question last week, and I got crickets, and so I won't ask it again. But the question is really, if you're deploying Wi-Fi, how many people do a business case before they deploy Wi-Fi? And really, the answer is no one, right? Because it's deemed table stakes. I think we have to start looking at smartphone coverage, public safety coverage inside of buildings as table stakes. And I think once you start doing that, your mindset changes. Is there an ROI? Sure, there is. I mean, productivity increases, and you can get into a lot of different soft costs from an overall perspective. But I read a report recently that asked the question just of nurses of, how many people expect to deploy, how many hospitals expect to deploy a nursing solution that is smartphone based in the next 18 months? And it was well over 50%. So, even hospitals are not necessarily depending on Wi-Fi for the total connectivity anymore. And so I think when you start to look at those kind of things and you start to go, okay, I do want people connected no matter where they are, and that's inside my building, outside of my building, using the same applications. I think the ROI gets a lot easier. And there are plenty of soft costs inside of an enterprise that, with respect to mobility and productivity, that can help drive you there.
So Jennifer, to address what JMA Wireless, some of the things JMA Wireless does to help the ROI case, because we develop equipment, we can look at things we can do with innovation and with technology to optimize how it gets deployed in a venue. And you hear from us, complexities in these environments, but to put it in context, I mentioned Levi Stadium earlier. There's some 770 antennas in Levi Stadium, okay? Those antennas have to be wired back to remote units. There's some 340 some remote units there. All of those are fiber connected back into a head end somewhere, which ends up back to the base stations. Now, The way we approach that in terms of optimizing for ROI, when you go in and deploy a solution in a venue like that or in one of your enterprises, you'll look at how you actually get connected from the head end somewhere back out to these remote units using fiber. And to the degree you can optimize the use of that fiber, it means you can utilize either existing runs of fiber or you can minimize what you have to run. So we do deploy wavelength multiplexing to ensure that we can carry multiple carriers and multiple bands over a common fiber out to these remote units, thus reducing the amount of energy or the amount of fiber you need to utilize to get out there, number one. Number two, when you have multiple fibers, it just creates more opportunity for you to mix and match fibers between the different endpoints, which means I got to send people out to resolve those issues. If you take it a step further, you can optimize your equipment to understand when there's splices or patches along those paths and adapt so you don't get degradation among the different remote units. Normally, or quite often, you have to send manpower out there to go optimize each of those splices or optimize the remote units to adapt for the different degradation in the fiber lengths. So you can develop intelligence into your equipment that knows how to optimize these days, optimize for these environments. And as a result of that, what happens is you can spend days commissioning the system instead of weeks commissioning the system. And as soon as you say days instead of weeks, I'm talking about manpower that has to be in that facility. And it's usually, as you saw Paula's list on the screen, multiple types of manpower, because now I have labor to get you on a ladder rack that gets you up into the ceiling to do manual tuning of a remote unit. So we really look at how is the technology really optimized to make it easier to fulfill and deliver the solution. Once they're deployed, these things are often optimized as a process when the audience is actually using the system over a period of time. So we design in capabilities to remotely monitor what's going on across all the bands and remotely administrate the system so that the engineers can adjust this stuff without doing site visits with regularity. So it speeds up the process. It speeds up from deployment to commissioning and gets the system live and operational. All of these are investments that have to be made to get a system live and working. Reduce the investment, it's easier to get the return.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We really appreciate it. I, again, have 4 pages of notes, so thank you very much, and thanks, everyone, for coming.